Oh my gosh, this is all going so smoothly. So thank you, everybody.
Kathy, I'm still not a co-host yet.
You're not?
No.
Okay, I clicked the button. Let's try it again. Hang on, everybody.
He's the co-host now. I just saw it popped up.
Okay. I've just got to get a couple things ready. Okay.
Got it. All right.
Where is my other, hang on. I got to get okay. Here we go. Okay, everybody. Last year at Girlfriend Weekend, can you believe it was a year ago, January? But a year ago, January, I had gotten this book called What Would Dolly Do? And I am the biggest Dolly Parton fan in the whole wide world. There's heroes and she's my shero. And I thought, this is a book. We had a Dolly Parton look-alike contest. And I believe one of our queens that entered that contest is here today, Karen Reed. But I have to tell you, Lauren, today on CNN, it was announced that in Nashville, they're going to be putting up a statue of Dolly Parton. And they said, because what would Dolly Parton do? And I thought, how ironic on the day that you're going to be featured. Wow. That was the first book that I had picked of yours. And now you have a new one.
Yes.
So I want you to begin and in this limited time, tell us as much about the story behind these stories, and then conclude with what you're doing today, because that's fascinating too.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Lauren, do you want me to make you the share screen, or you want me to do it?
Do you want me to? I can do it if I know how. I don't know if I know how to do it.
All right, I'll go ahead and do it.
I don't know. I'll give you a signal. I'm going to try to move quickly through the presentation so that hopefully there's time for me to just do a little bit of a quick little reading at the end. But I am Lauren Marino, and I've been a professional book editor for 25 years, more than 25 years, but I made the cutoff at 25. I refuse to say 30 or higher. So I'm currently an executive editor at Hachette Books, and I'm also a writer. My third book is about to come out. The first one was Jackie and Cassini, A Fashion Love Affair, which was all about how Jackie Kennedy used style and fashion for diplomacy in the White House. And then What Would Dolly Do, which came out in 2018. And that's how I met Kathy. I cold called her. I chased her down and cold called her and said, I want you to read my book. And it turns out that she was a huge Dolly Parton fan, and that she is also involved in the Imagination Library. And I think that Dolly is, getting her due finally, and she has her own book out right now as well. But one of the greatest things that she has done, and one of the things that she says she's proudest of, was starting the Imagination Library. And she did it because she grew up in a house with 14 kids, and her father never learned to read or write. She was the first person in her family. There it is. Yeah, Dolly Parton storyteller or songteller. So she decided that literacy was going to be her big thing, and she really started it for her father, and her father learned how to read as an adult. But she has now given away well more than 100 million free books to children between the ages from birth until 5. And if you sign up for the Imagination Library, she will personally send you your child, your newborn, an age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate book from the day that they are born, once a month until they are 5, so that they are school ready. And we know literacy makes such a huge difference. So I'm a big fan of Dolly, but I'm here today to talk about Bookish Broads, which I wrote not this past summer, but the summer before on my front porch down in South Carolina. I took the summer off and it wasn't the summer off, and basically wrote 10 hours a day. for several months. And it, you know, I have been a book editor for so long and a writer. I've been a bookworm since the day that I learned how to read. And I imagine most of you are also bookworms. If you're all pulpwood queens, you're bookworms too. So I devoted my entire career to books. And for me, it was so delightful to go and do research and read parts of the works and go back and reread some of the work I had read before of all of these incredible, groundbreaking women through history who really had to overcome so many incredible obstacles. And it was hard to get out of the research rabbit hole because I could just sit there and read more and more and more about Eudora Welty or Charlotte Bronte or Toni Morrison or Zora Neale Hurston. I wanted to read everything about them. I started reading these long biographies of them, and then I started reading their works, and I said, how am I going to consolidate all of this information into essays that are, 2 or 3 pages long? So it was a challenge, and I didn't get to put in everything that I wanted to, but I tried to focus on the obstacles that they had to overcome in order to become published writers, the themes and the groundbreaking subject matter that they covered, and sort of put them in the context of where they were in history. So I profile 65 writers, and I start in the very beginning of 10th century, and I go up to the present day, and I sort of picked my favorites or people that I thought had made serious contributions over time. So it was a very geeky project, but I was in heaven. And I think, I want to write more Bookish Broads, and Bookish Broads 3 and Bookish Broads 101. Like, I could just talk about female writers and write about them and research about them forever. And I worked with this really cool young New Orleans illustrator that I found to do these kind of hip, cool portraits of all of these women, to put them in their context and to sort of show what they were all about. So anyway, before we dive into kind of what's some of the things that are in the book, I wanted to start with a little quiz. So you don't have to answer out loud, but this, here's some geeky literary history questions. Who was the world's first novelist? Who was the first author to become a billionaire strictly from their writing? Whose books became the impetus behind the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the first to cry out the warning of climate change? Which author has sold more books in history outside of the Bible? And who beat out William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom for the Pulitzer Prize for Literature? So we can go to the next slide and see that the first Murasaki Shikibu wrote the first novel in 10th century Japan, The Tale of Genji. And she was in the court, but not of the court. She wrote a book that was 1,300 pages, some of it as poetry with over 400 characters. And it was sort of a soap opera of her time, following the Shining Prince, who's Genji, who had all of these wives and concubines. And she became very, very acclaimed in her own lifetime, despite paper not even existing. People were writing and rewriting her book by hand and circulating it through Japan. And she was the first person to write. Back then, Chinese was the man's language and the language of the government, and Japanese was the colloquial language of the women. And she wrote it in Japanese. So it's one of the first books ever written where they took the woman's language and turned it into something that became literature. Then on the next slide, J.K. Rowling is the first author to become a billionaire just through her writing. When her marriage ended in divorce, she became clinically depressed, and she moved to Edinburgh with her newborn daughter and 3 chapters of what would ultimately become Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone in her suitcase. She would sit in a cafe and write while her baby napped, all while she was living on welfare, state benefits. And she would later say in her commencement speech at Harvard University that at the time she was jobless, a single lone parent, and as poor as possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. By every standard, I was the biggest failure I know. She is now the first billionaire, male or female, to which is really quite an accomplishment. Then on the next slide, 60 years before Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth hit the bestseller lists, the writer Rachel Carson, who is also a marine biologist and ecologist, was addressing the dangerous half-truths of the chemical industry and government policy in her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring. She wrote about the dangers of pesticides, particularly DDT, and that became the catalyst that created the US Environmental Protection Agency and the ban on a lot of dangerous man-made chemicals. But when you read her work, she was really, it's like reading poetry. You know, it's really, it's nature writing. She took scientific and nature writing and really took it to new levels. Then on the next slide, Agatha Christie's novels have sold more than 1 billion copies in the English language and another billion internationally. She's history's best-selling novelist. Her books are outsold only by the Bible and Shakespeare. Her novels have been translated into more than 100 languages. She wrote 66 crime novels in her lifetime, 6 romance novels, 24 plays, and more than 150 short stories. And as if that were not enough, she is also the most successful female playwright of all time. She wrote a play called The Mousetrap that started running in 1952. It is still running in the West End of London. It never stopped, which is pretty incredible. And then this is one of my personal favorites. I know the Margaret Mitchell Museum is in Jefferson, or I think it's the Gone with the Wind Museum is in Jefferson, Texas. And I was really hoping that I could go there and visit because I read Gone with the Wind when I was around 11 years old, and I just became obsessed with the Civil War. I became a big Civil War buff. I've probably read the book 5 times. The movie is a whole nother. I've seen that like I could recite it from beginning to end. And I had a 6-foot-tall poster of Clark Gable as Rhett Butler in my childhood bedroom. Like everyone else had Leif Garrett, and I had Rhett Butler. So. It took her over 10 years to write Gone with the Wind. It became a huge bestseller. It's the only book that she ever published. She sold the movie rights for $50,000, which back then was the largest amount of money ever paid for film rights for a book. And she beat William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom for the Pulitzer Prize novel in 1937. So that's all pretty influential, right? Margaret Atwood says, a word after a word after a word is power. And women who write are exercising their power, even in times, societies, and cultures where they had little power in every other aspect of their lives. Having a voice and being heard is the very epitome of power. So that power is often expressed by speaking about things, or in female writers, speaking about things that had not been written about before, all really parts, for better or worse, of the female experience. So we have Maya Angelou she wrote about sexual abuse and horrific racism, and I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, and she has several books, which is really like it's like an ongoing autobiography, and she led an incredible life, was a true groundbreaker. Virginia Woolf explored mental illness and the inner lives of women, which had, and sort of stream of consciousness, which hadn't really been done before. Sylvia Plath wrote about the frustrations of domestic life, ambivalence towards motherhood, mental illness, and suicide. Jane Austen satirized the financial motivations behind marriage and women's dependence on the institution. Anais Nin and Kate Chopin acknowledged that women wanted more than just to be a wife and mother, and that they also experienced sexual desire and not necessarily just within marriage. And Jeanette Winterson wrote the first mainstream lesbian novel. And then she also wrote a memoir called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, which is what her mother said to her when she came out. So it goes without saying, throughout history, female writers had many obstacles to overcome, not the least of which was a lack of access to education, because most women were not educated formally, really, until the early 20th century. They either had they either had a governess if they were very wealthy, or they had a father who had a library and allowed them access to them. But a lot of our famous writers like Mary Shelley and Jane Austen didn't even go to school. And when you look at their accomplishments, it's pretty mind-blowing. So they, with very little economic and legal rights, not only was it very hard for them to publish, but it was considered a rebellious act. So all of these women were very fearless in what they did by addressing the flaws and inequities of society and writing about things that were taboo. They often used novel and fiction to play coy or to disguise some of their ideas that weren't so easily written as nonfiction. And because of their subject matter, they are often not taken seriously. And not only were they not taken seriously, they were criticized, they were shut down, they were personally attacked, their reputations were ruined, and often their books were banned. So this slide, you can see, these are just some of the books that have shown up again and again on the banned books list. And when you look at it, most of these books are about sexuality and race, which is interesting. That's what people don't want women talking about race and sex. And yet, they were writing about the times in which they lived. They were writing what was their truth. So as a way to get around that, really before the 20th century, most women, as Virginia Woolf said, for most of history, anonymous was a woman. Women had to write under pseudonyms or under a male name or through initials. So I'll just list a couple of the better known ones. So when this author's first novel came out, she published it under a lady. She wanted the anonymity because women who wrote novels suffered from reputational damage and excessive criticism. So she hid she hid herself, but she made a statement by saying a lady. She wanted people to know that it was a woman who wrote it. And that, of course, was Jane Austen, and her first novel was Sense and Sensibility. Then Amandine Lucille Aurora Dupin moved to Paris and started mingling with writers. She often, she started writing with her lover and they wrote under the pen name Jules Sand. They collaborated. When she finally went out on her own to write, she wrote under the name George Sand. And her books became very successful, and she was a real groundbreaker of her time. But, people thought that a man was writing all of these books. Similar with Marianne Evans, who had several reasons to write under a male pseudonym. First, she didn't want to be stereotyped as a female novelist because female novelists were considered frivolous and silly. And she also wanted to maintain her privacy, given she was living illegally with a married man. Despite that, writing under the name George Eliot, she published Middlemarch, Adam Bede, The Mill on the Floss, and she got incredible reviews from the male establishment who did not realize it was a woman writing these books. She eventually came out as a woman. She also became the most financially successful writer of her time. She became very wealthy, which was quite rare at this time. And then I'm going to guess most of you know Kerr, Ellis, and Acton Bell, who were told by their publisher that if they used their female names, that they would not be published. So they started writing under their pseudonyms, the three sisters, and they went on to write books that have become, considered some of the best written, most famous books of all time. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And then Louisa May Alcott, she first started writing poetry and short stories under the name Flora Fairchild. Then she started writing, I guess she called them lurid thrillers, like Behind a Mask and a long fatal love chase. And she used the male A.M. Bernard. And those books made her extremely wealthy. It was her publisher who told her he wanted her to write Little Women, and she was very resistant. It wasn't really where her heart was, but it ended up becoming, her most popular and successful book. And then Nell Harper Lee was, of course, Harper Lee, which may seem obvious, but she dropped the more feminine Nell for the more ambiguous Harper when she wanted to get published, because she thought she'd have a better chance of getting published and having reviewers pay attention to her. But she also didn't want Yankees to mispronounce her name as Nellie, which I always, as a Yankee, I think that's very funny. And then even more recently, J.K. Rowling, whose real name is Joanne Rowling, published the first Harry Potter books using the ambiguous initials J.K. Instead of her first name, because there was a concern on the part of her publisher that a female author would not be read by boys. Boys would not buy a book written by a woman. Never mind that her books are beloved by boys and girls and men and women. But that is just whereas women have always read books by men, men rarely read books by women. And it's just a cultural prejudice that still really, as you can see, still exists. So this cultural prejudice is real, and I don't want to get too much on a soapbox, but I did a lot of research when I was writing this book just about who gets reviewed more, it's kind of shocking even today when you look at the statistics. But without going into too much detail, there is a list, there's a website called greatestbooks.org. And what they did is they used an algorithm to take 129 of the best books lists that are out there, and created the top not even the best selling, the 100 greatest books of all time. And out of that, when you look at this, 17 out of 100 are by women. And since Virginia Woolf and Jane Austen are in there twice, it's really 14. So you're looking at 14, the greatest books written in the history of the world, only 14% were written by women, according to all of these best books lists. And oftentimes it's the same, it's the usual suspects, as you can see: Emily Bronte, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Harper Lee. And it's kind of amazing to me as a lifelong reader, as a former English lit major, as a writer, and as a book publisher. In the book publishing industry, we know that 80% of books are purchased by women, and yet they're not and yet the greatest books are not attributed to them. So I'm not an academic, and I'm not going to get sucked into the great books in the canon, but it's kind of incredible to me. So just two little more quick things, and then if there's time, I can read. And I think I'm running out of time, but
we are running out of time.
Okay, so I don't have to read an excerpt. I was going to read you Dora Welty, which is super fun, and I figured since there's a lot of people from the South and Mississippi, but my book is coming out February 9th, and it's available, and I'm going to be the September Pulpwood Queen book choice, so we can go, we can talk about it then as well. So thank you so much, everyone.
Well, we're going to feature you some more times throughout the year, so don't worry that fall we'll get you on our Breathless Bubbles and Books. We'll get you on our online all book club, and maybe I should just do a Zoom with just you and me, when it's time, or whenever. You just email me, we'll set up a Zoom and we'll
Awesome.
put it out there on my Kathy L. Murphy channel. I love you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Everything that you're putting out there is everything I adore. Keep writing. And I've got to get those books. I mean, I've got the Dolly book, but I don't have Bookish Broads, and I don't have your first book. So
No, I'll send them. Bookish Broads is, I just got finished copies yesterday, which is so exciting. And, you know,
very excited.
got
And
all
you
these
know,
cool
it
portraits.
doesn't-
So I just got it. So a copy is on its way to you, Kathy.
Okay. Well, I
Thank you
just
so
wanted to
much.
say, it doesn't matter to me when your first book was written. If I like the book, I'm going to work it in the program because it's all about the story. So just keep them coming to me. And, you know, Hachette was my publisher. So I wish you the best of luck with them. Keep me books coming because I get nothing. I
Okay.
have no idea what's going on with Hachette these days. So,
All right, you got it. I got some good ones
okay.
coming up.
And
All right.
if you all want to get a hold of Lauren, you're on Facebook.
I'm on Facebook, and I also have my own website. So it's Lauren Marino Books. And there's a thing in there where you can email me.
Perfect. Okay.
Yep.
So next up, we'll see you in a few, but I've got to bring on our next author. So let's see if we can figure out how to get back to the group. There we go. Oh my gosh. This is the best lunchtime authors ever. Lauren was amazing. But now I've got to tell you, when my first book came out, I was a nobody. And I was put on a panel with Adriana Trigiani, Lee Childs, Debbie Monochromer in Book Expo. And Adri was having a hair moment. And I had just been at the Redken headquarters. I was doing this thing with them because they used to sponsor my hairball. I lost them a long time ago, but I can't remember which boy group was there, but there was one of those boy groups, you know, it wasn't the Backstreet. What's the other big boy group that was popular in that time?
I should remember this, Kathy. You told me.
I know, but they were there and I was there and we took all these pictures and then they gave me all this product and it was for curly hair. And
For frizzy hair, Kathy, for frizzy.
Yeah, and you go, oh, my hair's so frizzy. And I go, hey, I've got the perfect, and I pulled out of my bag this Redken ensemble. And that's how we first met.
Uh-huh.
And she writes books that are just so amazing. And now I'm going to show you. I just got it and it's autographed and I'm thrilled. This is her latest book. Can you guys see it? It's really wonderful. It's called The Shoemaker's Wife. It's a novel. I want this as a poster. I would like to wallpaper my wall with it.
I have it. I'll send it to you.
I'm not kidding you.
I have a big poster of it. That's a Louise Dahl Wolf photograph.
It's absolutely stunning as you are. And I love your hair. I mean, I'm trying to emulate my straight.
This is a
hair.
my pathetic attempt at a tiara.
Well, I think it's fabulous. So I'm turning the program over to you. And you guys, you know, I've been to Italy and taken my Pulpwood Queens over and over, but this book, give us a story behind the story.
Well, it's first of all, I love you, Kathy, and this is amazing. And I would only do this for you. This is like, I don't even know what it is. I didn't put away the Christmas decorations yet, and I do a wreath of roses and I stuck them in there. What can I say? Okay, so to tell you about this book is to really tell you the story of my family, because it's my grandparents' love story on my mother's side. You know, it's interesting when you know, as I have a daughter and, you know, you think about what you want to pass down. And I think the most important thing that we can give our kids is the story of what happened. So when I was very young, I would ask my grandmother a lot of questions about Italy. Now, to just explain where my family's from, I based the story exactly on what happened, except I did one fantasy thing that I'll tell you about in a second. But there are two towns in the Italian Alps. My grandfather, Carlo Bonicelli, was from a town called Vilminore, And his eventual wife, Lucia Spada, was from a town 3.5 miles away called Skilpario. But they met in Hoboken, New Jersey. Because my grandmother and great-grandfather had come over. They were making a purse, means you made some money, to return home to build a house. Now, my grandfather had come over and returned to Italy and then come back and decided that he would earn his Italian citizenship as a young man by renouncing the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele, and signing up for World War I. And that becomes a very important part of this novel, because what happened to my grandfather in World War I changed the shape of our family forever. So my grandmother was a seamstress, and eventually he took her, the third part of the book takes place in Minnesota in a town called Chisholm on the Iron Range. He was a shoemaker, and then to make extra money, like everybody did then and are doing still, had a second job, which was, he was in the iron ore mines. But he had been in the iron ore mines, and then when he went back to Italy, mined there, and then came back here and learned his craft of shoemaking in Italy. But what was interesting or revelatory about the second part of the story was that when he got back from World War I, he had developed, and they told them this, he had been gassed in the trenches of France. And when you're gassed, you first of all don't realize it unless you're really close to it and you get burned. But my grandfather could smell it, and mustard gas smells like garlic. So if you're Italian, you know that that scent in the home is like when somebody's cooking, is very familiar, but that eventually would kill him. And when he returned home and married my grandmother and went to Minnesota, which is all chronicled in this novel, he figured out that, you know, he thought he could beat it. First of all, he sort of forgot when he returned, or put it in the back of his mind, that when he returned and he was in his early 20s, his platoon officer said, "None of you will see your 40th birthdays." And he died when he was 39. And so when I was little, these are the stories I heard. And I felt like really that I had to wait until I had some knowledge and maturity and distance from this story. And so it took me a very long time to write it. I first interviewed my grandmother. When I say interviewed it, I just basically, whenever I visited, wrote down every word she said. And I would ask questions, and she wasn't the type that really wanted you to do that, but she did it, and she was very gracious about it. And so later I gathered all those notebooks and began to develop the story. The fantastical element that I put in here was, to me, as a young person, I thought my grandmother's life was so sad. She left her mother, she could never return, just like Enza in the book. She had violent motion sickness. Well, now you can medicate that, but then you couldn't. There was nothing for her. And my great-grandfather thought he would lose her on the passage. That's all chronicled here. And I even have the name of the ship and the ship's doctor. Like, I like to put real facts in these novels. So he took her to Minnesota. They went on a train. It was done in such short, they didn't do like the super cheap, like a fast train. What they did was they did it in increments, and she didn't get sick that way. They did it in very short increments. But once she got to Minnesota, she never left Minnesota. That was it. So I wanted to really have this character who went to America to make a little money to go back home, and then she never went home. So Enrico Caruso she loved the opera, and I actually inherited her records. So I have all of those records. And for those of you who are into music, you know that Enrico Caruso is one of the only artists we have of that era, because the other opera singers were very fancy, and they felt like they didn't want to record. They thought it was kind of cheesy to sell it when you weren't there singing it. So we have a really wonderful collection of his singing because he believed, as an Italian, that the opera was for the working people. So I got to give my grandmother that gift of knowing him. So I created the whole world of Enrico Caruso and the Metropolitan Opera at the time, and it segued beautifully with World War I. So that's the element that's a little fantastical. And then elements of the novel that are true, I got some from some of my cousins that are older that my grandmother confided in. And it just made the story become very luscious. So it begins in Northern Italy. They come to Hoboken. My grandmother had not a great situation with a cousin. You had to be sponsored when you emigrated. You had to have a sponsor. So her sponsor was a distant cousin who wasn't nice, but I really made her not nice. And it's all these missed. If you love stories where people keep missing each other, that's what really happened. So that's what this is. You know, in terms of, you know, my family life and the impact that this story had, is my mother's one of 3 kids. And you're going to read about a character in the novel. My uncle Orlando, who was my mother's oldest brother, was a basketball star in Minnesota in the 30s. And in 1939, he got a full ride to Notre Dame. So he went from Chisholm on the Iron Range to Notre Dame. When he was at Notre Dame the second year, he was drafted. You couldn't, like for the Vietnam War where they said I'm in college and I have a family and I can't go. When they got to the office, my mother's she was a twin. She and her sister are both gone now, but they were younger than my uncle Orlando. And my mother remembers that my grandmother accompanied him. He came home from college and took him to the draft office. It was right on Main Street. They had them everywhere. And this story was told so many times in my family that I think it changed me in certain ways. She goes in there, she's a widow, right? And she was widowed at 35 years old, never remarried, never went out with a man. She took in sewing from the local department store, would not measure the men for their pants. She made the department store. I mean, it's like, that's her, okay? She's like this character. So she goes with him and they're waiting on the line, and then they come up and they ask for the war history. And so they say that Carlo Bonicelli died due to whatever. And my grandmother knew where he was stationed and all of that, and had their paperwork that they were citizens and all that. And so the man behind the table, and this was for the Navy, the officer behind the table said to my grandmother, he doesn't have to go, Mrs. Bonicelli, he doesn't have to go because he's the only male in the home. And my grandmother said, she took a moment and she said, no, we're Americans and we're proud of that. And he goes like everybody else. So my mother, see, I cry and they're gone and it's like terrible. But anyway, that was the heart of this book, to get to where they had a child, and a really important part of it. Those are the values that these immigrants had. So it's very difficult for me sometimes. And I love that all my Southern girlfriends are on this listening. My story and my family's not unique. You know, people really sacrificed. And so my mother told me when they came home, you know, he was given his orders where he had to go, and he's going to, I think, first San Diego, and then he was in the Pacific Theater. And my mother said that my grandmother's hair that was black turned white, and it never came back. That's how emotional this was for her. And so I thought about that, and I thought a lot about, because when you're writing a novel, you know, you're in control of it. I could let him live. I could let him die in the Pacific. It could be any number of things. And I got to that point in the novel, and the characters by then take over, and I had outlined it, and I couldn't let him die. There's the one time I said, I can't let him die. But I was there, and it's not in this book. My uncle got a virulent kind of cancer, and he died before his mother. And he lived in Chisholm with his beautiful wife, Jerry, who was my godmother. She's originally from Chicago. And he would visit her every day. Every day he had lunch with her or breakfast or something with her, coffee. He went to see her every single day, and she'd had a stroke. So we all went to Minnesota, and I was in the room with my brothers and sisters and my father and mother when we went in after he died. And she made a sound that I have never heard since. I don't even know how to describe it to you. It was the deepest sound of grief. And it wasn't wailing in tears, it was a wounding sound. So the first thing I'm going to ask God when I get there is, why would you take her son before her? I didn't understand it. So death of children and that, as you know, are often themes in my novels, but that I cannot reconcile, and I still can't, but this book took me back into that, you see. So you're going to hear a lot of novelists, and everybody does it differently. For me, it always has to be about family. It starts, the grain of it, the kernel of it always begins with the family story. And in that story, there's always a lot of humor, usually, not like today. I'm glad this is vodka because I can't take it, but I'm kidding. The family story, the granular family story is what's fascinating to me. And it's fascinating to me when I read. So in this instance, with this particular story, I took the truth, but then I had to imagine some things. What was my grandfather, who I never met, like when he was young? So I built the character based on what I knew. And you'll love this, it has evolved. I knew my cousins on my grandmother's side, who I love and I'm still close to. And if you ask me where my spiritual center is, I would tell you it's equally in Appalachia, where I was raised, and in the Italian Alps, mountains and mountains. So when I went in there and I went back and I started to meet my Bonicelli cousins, it was a revelation. It was incredible. And then pieces of the story of his side came to me after I wrote this. Some of the things I had guessed at were right. Now, I had no way of knowing that. I just made it up. But it was as it had been. And then one cousin who came to see me. Now, my mother was gone. And we had gone to Italy many times with my mom and gone up that mountain. But when you're with your mother, there's only certain questions you can ask. You can't just ask, anything. My mother was very sensitive. So I would have to pick my moments with her because I didn't know what it was like to be in a shoe shop where they cut leather. I didn't know. I had studied it. I had gone over and researched when I wrote Very Valentine, but I wanted my mother's memories. They're all in here. So, if something happens to me, I told my daughter, read this book and you'll know everything, because I wove it in somehow. But my mother, my mother would cry. See, I've got a little bit of that in me, but I'm not generally a crier. But if I talk about this story, I always cry because it seems to me that the story was just so tremendously sad. And I feel helpless in the face of the story. But this is how we built America. your people, everybody within the sound of my voice that's American, you know what I'm talking about. You have the great aunt that was a whack in World War II. You have the, as I do, you have the draft that every man had to go. My father's a veteran. My father was allowed to go to college. He got married, and he and my mom were stationed in Hawaii at the end of the 50s. So, you know, there's this whole, people had a sense of service. Service. They didn't dodge it. They signed up. They didn't make up stories to get out of it. They bravely walked into it. That's what this book's about. It's about that kind of courage to leave your home and start over again. Now you could say, oh, they were happy they found love. Absolutely, that was great, but it was brief. It was brief. My mother was 8 and her brother was 11. So they had been married 12 years, my grandparents, and they married in Hoboken when he got back from World War I. And it was a miracle he got back from World War I because, and I don't know if you know this about World War I, but a lot of our forefathers that fought in World War I did it to get their citizenship. So my grandfather served with a huge contingent of Puerto Ricans. There were Italians, Puerto Rican, there were Irish, there were, I mean, it was very mixed, diverse, you would call it. But he, as an Italian, had learned English, signed up, went for it. And so until we were no longer, when my mother died, all of his paperwork was framed on the walls of our home. So I knew the boat, the Rochambeau. I knew everything from all those framed artifacts on the walls. They were so proud to be American. They were so, they got it. They got what they had to do. And when it came time for her son, you're going too, which I think is a very powerful, you know, especially if somebody tells you, yo, your kid doesn't have to go. Wouldn't you go, oh, all right, great, thank God. She kind of made the ultimate sacrifice in offering him up. So this novel of a family, but really a novel of the family that comes after. Because when you find out what they did, and in my family, I'd say we talked about it a lot, but the granular nature of it, if you haven't asked these questions, you must ask them. If you remember the story, you must write it down, because you will not, there will come a point when you don't remember things. And you're going to want whoever comes after you to know what happened. Now, some folks said, why didn't you write it in a nonfiction fashion? Well, there were a lot of reasons. First of all, it's how it comes to me. I'm not an investigative journalist. I'm interested in that, but I wanted to take you to Italy and for you to have the experience that I have when I go, which is I feel redeemed when I get up on that mountain and I don't want to leave. And I, you know, during this pandemic, I'm making lists of why I'm grateful. And one of the reasons I'm grateful is because I know where I have to go to be redeemed, to feel I can think and I can start over and I can rejigger my thoughts. And whenever I go, and the last time I went was right before the pandemic, that summer, I felt like I got so much new information that I would be able to share with you going forward. So when I look at the world in a kind of a different way, I'm on the hunt all the time for the story. What happened and why did it happen? So Shoemaker's Wife, read it, reach out to me anytime. I would love it. And I want to talk a little bit about the one that I just turned in that'll come out, we don't know, I think early next year. And I'm going to tell you the story, and I as fast as I can, because I've got my eye on the clock. I want to be a good soldier. So in 2018, I'm in Scotland to direct a movie. For those of you who know, I wrote and directed Big Stone Gap. It became a feature film, and you can watch it on Netflix, called Big Stone Gap. I wrote and directed it. Then, and prior to that, I had done a documentary, and I really love the cinema. And it's a completely different skill set writing a script. It's not anything like this. This is like you're free. When you're writing a movie, you have things you have to do to dramatize a story. So I had been on the Today Show. I think with this, I don't remember what book it was. And afterwards, Kathy Lee Gifford said to me, I wrote a screenplay. And I said, how great, you know. I said, what it's about, what is it about? And she told me, and I said, okay. I took it home and I read it. You know, when people give you a screenplay, you get a sick feeling in your stomach, oh God, what is this about? How am I gonna tell her? But the heart of it was this great story. She had done an expert job in a lot of ways. And then in other ways, she was a first-time screenwriter. She didn't know things. So I read it, I call her, I said, let's get together, I'll tell you everything. We got together, and then a series of events happens. Well, she says to me, will you direct this movie? And I said, sure, yeah, I'll direct it. Just let me know when. Thinking, oh, it took me 13 years, I'll be dead. Anyway, I get a call from her like the next week, we're making it. And I had seen her on the Today Show with Craig Ferguson, and the story takes place in Scotland, and it's called Then Came You, and it is on Amazon Prime, Apple iTunes. Don't miss it. She wrote the music. She wrote the lyrics. Brett James wrote the music, and it is a delicious little upbeat, happy jewel of a movie that takes place in Scotland. And like, I think 75% of Americans have some Scottish. I married a man of Scottish descent, so 75%. So you want to see this because you're going to want to go when this pandemic's over, okay? Well, anyway, when I'm over there, you know, I got there early. The director, you're running a crew of 350 people. You are creating I'm supporting, and Kathy Lee, you know, she had 3 hats. She was the leading actress. She was the lyricist, and she was a producer. And the screenwriter. She had 4 jobs. If I keep talking, I'll add more. So she was ready to go. Craig Ferguson is delicious. If you watch the movie, you will ovulate. I'm just telling you. I could say that while I have this crown on. You'll ovulate. Anyhow, very sexy, very funny, and they are great together. So, but before they get there, I thought, oh, I'm here early. I don't have any ties to anything. I'd done my work, and I was waiting for the actors to arrive. So I made a list of places I'd go around Glasgow. And I'd been to Glasgow on book tour before, but I stayed in a very elegant place, and my feet didn't touch the ground. Now I was grassroots. Now I was, you know, in my tennis shoes, like out walking. And I decided to go to St. Andrews. And the reason I went to St. Andrews, it's a cathedral, but not like we have in America. It's teeny weeny. I mean, it was like a church, like any church in any town. So I go there, and there's a wedding happening. And which is great. And this is Alexa calling. Is she telling me to stop talking? Maybe. Oh, it's 1:25. She's just giving me a 5-minute warning. Okay, I can finish the story. So anyway, I get there, and there's a wedding happening. So I'm Italian, and if you're Italian, to attend a wedding or to see a bride on her wedding day is good luck. And I thought, I'm making a movie, I need luck. And I stood in the back of the church. If you're Catholic, there's a mass, and the mass is the same all over the world. But this was different because as I stood in the back in the foyer, there was me and the man in his kilt who's going to play the bagpipes when the bride comes out. And I found myself like I was watching a movie. Every song they played, we had just played at my mother's funeral. They were the songs my mother chose. So I thought, oh, this is a sign from God, and I'm crying. And the guy thinks probably I'm a cousin. I don't know what he thinks. Anyway, I go outside. And now I'm taking pictures. When I see you in life, say to me, show me the wedding. I'll show you. I took movies of the wedding. And so I'm taking pictures of the bride. Oh my God. It's like how green was my valley, her veils, you know, Scotland. It's like I'm alone. It's great. I hear a voice behind me. He goes, who are you? And I turned, and it was the priest. And I said, oh, Father, I'm just a tourist, but I came to see the cathedral, and then I saw and I just stayed through the mass. And so, what's your name? And so I told him my name. He said, oh, you're Italian. And I said, yeah. And he said, you need to see that garden. So I turned, and I swear to you, when I turned, he was gone. I don't know where he went. There's a lot of people out there, but I'm like, what happened? So I took a few more pictures, and then I made my way over to this garden, and I'm telling you all, I walked through that garden gate, and I was like, why did he tell me to come here? It was an old cathedral, and this garden was modern, and there were these shards of like glass, and they had sayings in Italian by the great thinkers, but the Greeks, like Seneca and Ovid, and well, I think he was Latin and he was Roman, but I'm trying to translate them, and I'm in there. Why did he tell me to come? And I followed. They had a little man-made stream, and then I saw on the wall the survivors of the Arandora star, and every name was Italian. So what happened to me when I went to make a movie starring Kathy Lee and Craig Ferguson in Scotland was that I found the most incredible story about immigrant Italians in Scotland. So it marries kind of all the themes that I love. So that'll be coming out next year. I think I'm almost done, and I want to be a good soldier. I don't want to overdo it. But that's the story. Yes.
Fantastic, fantastic story. And I want everybody to know that you started a book club. Yes. And
Kathy, you have to come and do it like in the next couple weeks, because I know this beautiful, you're the leader. You have figured this out. I started it so that all these writers I met could talk about their books. And I'm saying here today, Lauren, I'm calling Lauren when this is over, because we have so many connections. This is what you've done, Kathy. The only person that I would put my Christmas wreath roses in my head for. You have artfully brought it to us in such a great way. And because I'm also a Southerner, I totally get it. We are ardent, but you are our leader. So, and I want you to come on. And any of your authors, just come.
But I want to put out the invitation for you for 2022. And I want you to have a panel for you and your book club.
Mm-hmm.
And she sent me this amazing Italian dinner package. And I go, that must be what it's like to be a New York Times bestselling author, because
honey, it's been a hard year and you need to do some pasta. Now, and it was made in Italy. And and if you know the cookbook author, Rosella Rago, she's a star. She's in her 30s and she cooks with her grandmother.
It's amazing.
And so I met her, and I think she's a star. And they make this stuff. They bring it over.
And to have you send me a signed book that I got here overnight because I didn't have a copy. But honestly, God, if you give me that poster, it's going up in my house. I mean,
I have it here. You're getting it. And just before I go, I have to tell you, I met on the phone. She died. But I met this model because she's been on all my books, Lucia, Tony's wife, Kiss Carl. This is Mary Jane Russell from South Carolina. She had 3 sons. I know this is so crazy. And this is a Louise Dahl Wolf photograph. We talked on the phone because she was walking through Target, saw Lucia in 2003. And she said to her niece, that's me. That's me on the cover. The niece called me, we connected. Do you know when this came out, 2 of her sons and daughter-in-laws showed up in Connecticut. They live in Connecticut and to talk about their mom.
Oh.
You see how little the world is? It's insane.
Well, I've got to have you meet my other author, Stephanie Chance, who takes Americans to Italy.
I must meet her.
Stephanie Chance, and she's working today, but I've got to connect you two because I've gone on her trips.
Okay.
And
then I want to connect her and Gina Casella, who does AT Escapes. We got to get all these women together.
And we all got to go. We all got to go. But the
together.
Before we let you go is I shared before your publicist, your assistant sent me your book trailer. It's on YouTube. And I cried so hard during that book
You
trailer
will.
because the music of Caruso, the opera music with your story, this, you got to make that into a film. Are you making this into a film?
I hope so. You know, I hope so. I would even like it to be one of those series because there's so much.
Yes.
One of those 8-parters or something.
How many of you would watch this series? I mean, come on. The Pulpit Queens are behind you all the way. We're around the world. We're going to make it happen.
Let's do it.
Make it happen. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jump in on any of this.
I know I'm a member. I got my ticket. I have my world pass. I can watch all of it, and I will.